He's sick today, the Russian ambassador. Welcome, our dear members, dear friends, dear colleagues. My name is Oleg Prozorov. I'm the director of the Belgian-Luxembourg Chamber in Russia. And this is our conference, which is dedicated to the new reality today, which is organized by us with the sponsorship of Arendt Medernach and RCB Bank, to who I say thank you very much. I also say thank you very much to Ekaterina Trofimova, who allow us to do this very interesting, I hope, conference. I'm sure, not hope. And also I greet our chairman of the board, Arkady Aryanov, who is sitting here in front of me. Je vais abréger la partie ici. And I would like to let the floor to the man without who this event will not be possible. Is our first vice president of the chamber in Luxembourg and the partner of Arendt Medernach, Max Kremer. Please.
Thank you, Oleg. That's very nice words to give all the applause to me. Thank you. But in fact, it was Oleg who took the initiative to ask us if you would be able and willing to host this nice event today in our Arendt house in Luxembourg. My name is Max Kremer. I'm a partner at Arendt Medernach in charge of the Russian and CIS market. So I'm also heading our Moscow representative office. And that shows the link that I have with Oleg, because I've been appointed the first vice president of the Chamber of Commerce. And the very good news is that this is the first event organized by the Chamber of Commerce in Luxembourg. So this is a premiere, and we are very happy to have such an interesting topic, which will today be outlined by our friends from ACRA rating agency. And afterwards, Mr. Larin will say a word about their banking operations here in Luxembourg. And my partner, Philippe-Emmanuel Partsch, who will join us in some minutes, he's still stuck in a meeting, will give an outline on the latest development of the European sanctions, which is obviously a topic where everybody is interested in, and we can ask all type of questions afterwards that you might have in this respect. And I will be short because I think everybody is tired from the long working day and is waiting for the interesting presentations, and afterwards also for the drink, where we are going to invite you here just next door. Then I would say I leave the floor to our friends from ACRA to start their presentation. Thank you very much.
Donc we start with the presentation, and then the questions, if you have, will follow after. Voilà. Thank you very much. Екатерина, я передаю вам слово.
Merci beaucoup, merci pour cette opportunité. Pour ACRA, c'est la première fois à Luxembourg, même que ce n'est pas la première fois qu'on fait les présentations en Europe. And I switched to English because just to follow the short tradition which we've already created. Thank you very much. For ACRA, this is the great opportunity, our first time in Luxembourg. I'm sure not the last. We've been touring around Europe and around some other big financial markets for quite a while already. But again, for us, this is the great opportunity to be here today with you, and thanks for spending some time with us. ACRA is a relatively recent creation in Russia, but Russia is making many things very fast and new, and sometimes even when European Union fails. Because you might know that amid the criticism of international rating agencies during the global crisis, European Union tried to set up a rating agency but failed because of whatever reasons. Russia introduced the same initiative but succeeded, and probably something to share with you how we did it. Analytical credit rating agency was created about 2 years ago, and again for us this is a great opportunity to spend our second anniversary with you. But first of all, I would like to present our team members who are sharing the floor with me today. Myself, I'm the CEO of the rating agency, and I have some other founding members with me, like Anouar Hassoune, who is our member of the board. Natalia Porokhova is the head of our research and forecasting team. and Kirill Lukashuk is the senior director and the head of our banking rating group. And these are very much the subjects which we would like to share with you and to cover during this presentation. Macroeconomics, banking, main industries, main vulnerabilities and opportunities, and then certainly would like to address your questions, if any, either through during the cocktail or during this open session. But first of all, some words about ACRA, if I can switch slides. Sorry. Oh. Yeah, you can be perfect, but when the technology doesn't work, you fail. This is what we learn in the rating business as well. Well, probably to start it a little bit earlier, in terms of the history track of how ACRA was created, what led to it. You might have heard that Russia has been working on upgrading its financial infrastructure for quite a few years. Some years ago, Russia upgraded its stock exchange quite substantially. And when in 2013 the mega regulator, the central bank, became the mega regulator in Russia and took over the responsibility for oversighting the rating industry, which before that has never been really regulated in Russia, decided to introduce the law on rating agencies, just a word-by-word replica from the law by ESMA, if you know the financial markets regulation in the European Union, which led to some legal cliff. Because, and this is something which is being discussed right now with the European Union and potential Brexit. You might know that the global 3 rating agencies have their offices in UK, and if Brexit really happens, it means that they will need to kind of reproduce their activities in 2 different jurisdictions. As there is no kind of common recognition of the 2 jurisdictions between European Union and Russia, by law, the Russian regulator, the central bank, requested the top 3 being present in Russia for many, many years to convert their offices, which are branches, into fully fledged operating offices, which they refused to do. Which meant that while there was a kind of a trade-off for it, interestingly, Russia is probably one of the few countries using the ratings the most in the world. There are more than 70 various regulations, government decrees, whatever, related to ratings. Russia uses ratings heavily, but until recently, it was an interesting phenomenon. The biggest rating market and the biggest non-regulated. As soon as the regulation was introduced, again copied word by word from the European regulation, there was the request for the top 3 to convert their offices. They refused, and Russia found itself without any ratings. Problem. The problem was resolved through creating a new rating agency, which was ACRA, and through upgrading some, unfortunately, very weak local rating agencies which existed for quite a while. That is why right now in Russia there are 2 rating agencies which are licensed by the central bank. One of them is ACRA, and ACRA is the only one which is fully licensed and fully legally recognized, because another one, Expert, is still working on it. We rate all categories of financial and corporate institutions in Russia. No, it doesn't help. Oh, yeah, it moves. In terms of the coverage, even if ACRA was founded in the end of 2015, by now we already cover almost 80% of banks in terms of the bond market, almost 70% of regions. We now have the portfolio which is comparable to what the top 3 have in Russia. And the coverage in corporates is only growing, but this is very common. Corporates usually in Russia are moving slower than financial institutions. That is why if you check our webpage and the addresses in the at the lower right corner of the slides, you would see that new ratings and new press releases are being published almost every 2 days. our corporate governance from the very beginning was a very important element of the creation of ACRA, because we needed to move things fast, really in the proper way. We're very proud to be the rating agency with the most diversified shareholding structure in the world. We have 27 shareholders, each of them having 3.7% stake, all equal, and with no representation in the board of directors. We wanted to make it very independent. Here I would like Anouar to jump in and to comment about our corporate governance and the overall running principles of ACRA. But here we have a very nice presentation. It's not only diversification by names in terms of our shareholder structure, but industries, types of ownership. We have state-owned companies, banks, foreign-owned banks. You can find here Raiffeisen, Societe Generale, Unicredit. We have Moscow Exchange, and all of them are equal. Even one of the three main business publishing houses in Russia, Kommersant, which is just near our webpage name. Anouar?
Yes, thank you, Ekaterina. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a couple of words on the corporate governance of the rating agency, but you have to understand where we come from. I mean,
can you switch the slide, please?
Back in the days, we had the obvious understanding that the large rating agencies were not doing a proper job in Russia. And the evidence of it is that after 2 years, we managed to reach the same level that they reached after 2 decades. But we were very happy at the board, and the composition of the board will tell you that, to help, support both Ekaterina, of course, but also the Russian Federation in setting up a Russian-based rating agency under 2 conditions. The first condition is that that rating agency should be world-class. You will see the presentations of the group heads in a minute. It is world-class. And the second condition was that the board and the operations of the rating agency be absolutely independent. The board was not ready to accept any form of interference, any form of meddling, and any form of pressure. A rating agency, to be credible, should be independent and competent. The competence we have, the independence we have. From there, we started at a very high level. The challenge now is to remain at that level. And that's exactly the challenge we have asked our colleagues to follow, to stick to, and to achieve in the years forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is exactly the principles, the key managing principles about which Anouar was talking about, and we modestly hope that these are exactly the ones which helped us to achieve this very high recognition locally and internationally. We're very proud that we are frequently invited speakers in almost every single event on Russia, locally or internationally. And certainly the basis, as I mentioned, was the corporate governance principles, which we're looking after very, very carefully, but also our methodologies. If you're aware of how regulation and rating agencies work, this is where, again, Russia was ahead of the global market. Normally, it consists of 2 parts. Compliance, corporate governance, about which I already told you. If you ever come to our office, and again, you're most welcome, you would physically be surprised. When you get in, you would see that our office is physically divided by 2 Chinese walls. Our analysts are physically sitting separately from our business people and never physically meet. They even have separated kitchen and toilets. They never cross each other. Separate entrances, this is the benefit. We certainly do not have the advantage of many, many years of experience, but when you're catching up in a very short period of time, you can really take the best and create from scratch something which is close to the perfect image of a rating agency. But the biggest value is really about the second part, which even the global rating agencies, the top 3, have never applied and now lobbying heavily against and fighting with the regulators. The second ideal perfect world regulation, the second part of it, it's about validation of methodologies. And this is the usual criticism which rating agencies are getting when people are questioning why you're relying so much on capitalization ratios, for example, when rating banks, while the correlation between capitalization ratios and bank failures is one of the weakest. The problem is that even if the methodologies are disclosed, the validation of them, not by default statistics, collected through many, many years and not really separated by regions or industries, but through proving every single element of analysis why you're using it and with certain weights. We did it. Our team worked as crazy for the first year or so by collecting all default statistics and by proving by every element why we're using it, why it's statistically important, and then we disclosed everything. We were the first rating agency in Russia who opened all its draft methodologies for discussion with the market, and we collected a lot of comments. This is what Russian market appreciated as well. We know from our methodological group that up to 50% on general of the comments we collected from the market were incorporated in the final versions of our methodologies. That is why every draft of our methodology, not formally but physically, is discussed with the market. But again, we independently take all our decisions how we determine the ratings. Another important difference of national ratings compared to international ratings, and why we think that what we achieved was not really import substitution, as a very famous term in Russia in the context of sanction regimes. We even came up with a new term, import supplementation. We strongly believe that the product we're delivering to the market adds to global ratings, not supplement them. Why? Because we're giving a somewhat different picture, and this is the most visible by looking at 2 rating scales. International scale, and you know this phenomena of being capped by sovereign rating, which means that all ratings in Russia, as I mentioned, heavily used for regulatory purposes. For example, for listing of all our bonds or securities, ratings are required in Russia. They are kind of grabbed in this 6 or 7 rating notches kept by the sovereign ceiling, as you can see here. What we did, we introduced 21 grades. And this meant that we're giving more kind of colors to the ratings. For example, historically, all sovereign issuers, weak, strong, whatever, but anybody related to the sovereign usually was rated at the level of the sovereign rating, which by definition was wrong, and which was not correlating properly with the bond validations, the performance of the debt in the markets, but for example, this FINA gradation, which we use for our ratings, shows better performance and better correlation with the market statistics. That is why we have 21 grades, and it means that sometimes quite a different picture to what investors got used to. Even investor relations are not always happy because they used to be selling for years, and for some of them for decades, for their debt risk being equal to the sovereign, which is not the case anymore. That is why if you ever Google ACRA name, and well, we're fighting against it, but this is the democracy. In Wikipedia, they even put a special section, whoever did it, about conflicts, criticism we're getting, even from our shareholders. Well, check, it's quite exciting. In terms of methodological toolbox, again, this slide just captures some of the methodologies, but again, the list is getting longer and longer. It's interesting, and this is another difference and another shortfall of the global rating industry, which we took into consideration when building the rating agency. For example, the first analytical team which we found was a research and forecasting team. Before assigning ratings, we publish medium-term forecasts, and you're most welcome if you cover Russia. For example, for some of the industries, we're the only one producing detailed medium-term forecasts, just not qualitative as it is always done, but we're not afraid of taking the responsibility to put quantitative and detailed forecasts on our webpage. And again, everything is for free. You're welcome to use them. We also, just to show how open we are, we translate everything and publish everything simultaneously in Russian and English, because we want to be the window of information for the international world. Anouar was mentioning that unfortunately international rating agencies have been reducing for pure commercial reasons their activity in Russia, and we're very happy that a lot of international investors are getting to us for more and more information just exactly because we're delivering it. We publish research, at least 3-4 various forecasts or commentaries every month, again in 2 languages. You're most welcome to get access to them through our webpage. And we also have a Facebook page. If you ever want to put us a like, you're most welcome. We also introduced some revolutionary products for the Russian market. And just think about this, everything in 2 years. It's quite exceptional, and I should really thank our team being present here. One of them is financial stress index, and I'm sure Natalia, one of the authors, can talk about this more. Russia has never had it, which means that if you ever want to kind of put or track where the financial industry in Russia is in terms of its status, current situation, compared to the previous times, whether it is in distress or whether it is quiet. For example, when in summer there was a kind of a mini crisis in the banking industry, how do you measure it? Whether the market is panicking or not, how you do this? By machine learning, through whatever monitoring press, or through whatever stock exchange indexes, or through interest rates in the interbank market. By tracking each individual element separately, you would always get a very limited picture. What we did, as in some developed countries, like in European Union, for example, and again, Russia never did it. Normally, these are regulators who do this. We created a combined index and tracked it back on a daily basis for more than 10 years, which really shows that it works well. And now we're updating it on a daily basis with some comments. And this is a very good visionary picture of how the things are moving. We also do commercial research on request. That is why if you ever are interested, just have some contacts and please approach us. This is something which the central bank, our regulator, let us do, and we certainly take this opportunity, especially in the context of reducing analytical coverage in many big international banks. The demand is growing, and we're here to help you with this. We're also growing globally, and this is the first, and again, think, in 2 years, all of this done. We already have, and we're the only rating agency who was able to achieve a partnership with the Chinese rating agency. As you can imagine, in China, the market of ratings is considered to be extremely sensitive, and by estimating the quality of what we do, they accept it as partners. The announcement of the partnership is relatively recent. We announced it only in the beginning of November, but we're working very actively with them. And one of the first products we introduced, a kind of a one-window rating. We're still far away, and we have no hope for achieving and convicting the 2 regulators to have a joint recognition of our ratings. On the other hand, if a Russian client can come to us, we would help them to get a rating from a Chinese recognized rating agency. our partnering rating agency in China is Golden Credit Rating. We're working on some other international projects, but certainly these will always come to complement our analytical footprint in Russia. We also try to customize our products and, for example, if we're delivering all information for free through our webpage, and we're already working with Thomson Reuters, we're in the very end of negotiations with Bloomberg, and our ratings are getting there as well. On the other hand, we are also providing this automatic downloads of ratings if this is more convenient for you, again in a customized way. And the last slide which I would cover, it's about our trainings. You've probably heard several times that unfortunately Russia lacks skills, lacks experience, and I think it's one of the main disadvantages of the current sanction regime is that unfortunately the inflow of new technologies, inflow of new knowledges is very limited in Russia. We're trying to help. We're very specialized in credit trainings, and we're now providing more than 10 various trainings, and very, very successful, and we're the only one in Russia. On various industries, the most recent one is on credit modeling in the context of IFRS 9. We're again the only to providing this expertise to the market. Now I'd like to leave the floor to Natalia, and unfortunately Anouar would need to leave us in a couple of minutes if you want to make some additional comments.
Yes, just to say goodbye, and two things just to finish from the board perspective. ACRA, and I'm not saying this because I'm on the board, is a very powerful weapon of mass credit intelligence. It's nowhere in Russia will you find a place where so much credit information at such a high quality is concentrated. It's impressive. Even ourselves on the board, and I'm speaking on behalf of the board, not just myself, are very, very much impressed by the quality of our people, which are praised on a daily basis. And what our clients say about us is also a tribute to what has been achieved over the past 2 years. They have been saying, when we visit Moscow, there is a place where we stop, and this place is ACRA, to learn about Russian credit and all what is about credit in the Russian Federation. It's not us saying it, it's our customers, and I think this was the biggest achievement of the year, thanks to these ladies and these gentlemen. Thank you so much for your welcoming, and Natalia, floor is yours.
Hello everyone. I am very pleased to be here and share our views on Russian economy. This year, Russian economy has returned to growth after a 2-year recession. Recession started in 2014 after oil price plunge and sanctions. And this year, we expect Russian economy to grow by 1.3%, and we expect midterm growth of 1.5%. Today, I'd like to draw your attention to 5 key trends which we expect will influence most Russian economy in the midterm. They are population aging and shrinking labor force, and actually now it's a main growth constraint in Russia. Low inflation. Last figure showed inflation rate in Russia less than 3%. Just imagine, inflation in Russia today is lower than in the United Kingdom, for example. And it's very incredible because we used to live in double-digit inflation for decades. It's the third its budget austerity. Russian government is eager to reduce dependence on oil revenues and cut budget spendings. The force is turned to east. Actually now the share of Asia is growing in Russian import, in Russian export, in investment, direct investment inflow, and even in debt. And the fifth, sanctions. Unfortunately, sanctions are still extending, and they are unlikely to be lifted in the midterm. So, population aging and shrinking labor force. Actually, why do I focus on it? Actually, it's a global common trend and it's nothing new. But in Russia, this common global trend now is enhanced by a very low birth rate in Russia in 1990s, when after the Soviet Union collapse, Russia was in deep crisis for a decade. And today, a small generation born in 90s has reached maturity, enters labor market, and can't substitute retiring generation of 50s. And for the last year, only for 1 year, Russian labor force declined by 1 million people. As I have read today, population of Luxembourg is half a million, yeah, and Russian labor force declined by 1 million or 2%. And population growth, so-called demographic dividends, its main contributor to economic growth in any country, in any economy. And you can't expect high economic growth from country with aging population and with shrinking labor force. Another growth constraint is double rise in price of import equipment after ruble depreciation in 2014. It constrains new investment in Russia now, but actually Russian producer has been adopting to this new exchange rate through switching to cheaper Chinese equipment. Actually now Russian economy is working near potential. Unemployment rate is low, only 5%, and unemployment rate of 4% is so-called natural level of unemployment. Capacity utilization rate is high as well. Of course, conditions are different between different sectors and industries, and for example, many car making factories are now standing idle, but average capacity utilization rate are high. And actually, last recession was not cyclical but structural. Here is upper estimate of growth potential in Russia. Our estimate of growth potential is in Russia is 1.5%, 1.8%, and productivity and efficiency improvement, according to our estimate, in the midterm has the largest potential to contribute to economic growth in Russia, about 1%. And actually intensive growth of 1% it's very high. it's even high for advanced economies, for developed economies. But historically, productivity used to contribute a lot to economic growth in Russia because actually our economy is very inefficient and a lot of can be improved. And in some sense, inefficiency is our competitive advantage. We have room for improvements. Extensive growth today is determined by investment made in last decade and slump of investment in 2015-2016. Already discussed, shrinking labor force will restrain economic growth by 0.4% per year. And it's likely that after presidential election next year, the Russian government will raise retirement age, and it will contribute to growth 0.3%, but one-off. The second important trend is low inflation. Low inflation makes Russian business environment more predictable, more certain, and debt more affordable. The Russian Central Bank started inflation targeting in 2015 when inflation was double-digit. Inflation target is 4%. Actually, the Russian Central Bank takes into account the Fed policy of 80s, when high inflation in the United States was suppressed by high Fed rates. And for the last 2 years, the Russian Central Bank key rates was above inflation by 3-5%. And in our base case scenario, we anticipate that inflation in midterm will be about target about 4%. But inflation in Russia are still very vulnerable to any volatility, to any shock in food prices, in oil, to tariff or tax growth, because non-monetary inflation is responsible for 2/3 of total inflation in Russia in comparison with developed countries where it's only 1/3. And we expect that monetary policy in Russia will be tough another 2-3 years, and key rate will be above inflation. Tough monetary policy has made Russian assets to be very attractive for investment and for foreign investment. Why we expect Russian Central Bank to keep monetary policy tough? To anchor inflation expectations. Actually, they are still high. And to be honest, I, as an analyst, anticipate inflation rate in this year 2.9%. But I, as a housewife, of course, don't believe in inflation of 3% in Russia, because I used to live in double-digit inflation 2 decades. Inflation in Russia in 90s was triple-digit, And it will take 2-3 years without, if there are no shocks, to bring inflation expectation to real inflation. And it's very interesting things are happening now. It's first time in our history when bank deposits in Russia, bank deposit rates in Russia are higher than inflation. But people looking at declining deposit rates, which are higher than inflation but lower than perceived inflation, are ready to take more risk and invest in bonds, in stocks, and mutual investment funds are growing fast now in Russia, and really it's first time since crisis of 2008. Of course, low inflation is very good news for Russian economy, but Russian business should adjust to it. Russian business get used to perform in high inflation environment and even used to benefit from high inflation environment. I guess if you get involved in Russian business, have you noticed that unemployment in Russia or in other CIS countries was not so significant problem during and after the crisis of 2008 in comparison with European countries? Actually, yes, unemployment rate during crisis in high inflation economies are always less than in low inflation economies, because in high inflation economies business are much more flexible in cutting costs in real term. For example, when you have high inflation, for example 15% as it was in Russia in 2015, you just may fix wages of your employees in nominal terms. Don't raise them following inflation and tell your employee, oh, it's hard time, be loyal to your company and maybe we raise your salary next year. And you gain in real term. Inflation high, your costs are fixing, and real term you cut costs. And now costs for Russian business become more rigid, and only choice is efficiency. Russian government intends to reduce dependency on oil revenues and implemented new fiscal rule which require to put all oil revenues above 40%, above oil of 40% per barrel in oil funds, and it means cut in government spending in next 2-3 years in real term or as a share of GDP. And on the one hand, it's a risk for social and economic development. It may increase inequality in Russia and actually decrease in inequality in Russia last years were fueled by outstripping growth in budget social payments. On the other hand, it's opportunity for business. Here two tricky circles. I just placed it here to inspire you to get to our website and read our fundamental research on Russian debt map. But these two circles show balance of debt in European Union and Russia. And in Russia, financial sector is still playing much less smaller role in comparison with advanced market, and the role of government are still very high, and Russian government will transfer function to business, in insurance, in healthcare, in education, and its opportunity. Sanctions. Economic sanctions on Russian economy focus on two spheres, mainly two spheres, financial sector and oil and gas sector. Sanctions in financial sector has been already absorbed, and Ekaterina has already shown you the slide with our financial stress index, and you can see that financial stability, our index measures financial stability, has already returned to pre-crisis level. And for example, sovereign bond yields, Russian sovereign bond yields today are even lower than before crisis, than before 2013. Sanctions has not absorbed in oil and gas sector, but I will tell about a bit later. And unfortunately, sanctions on Russian economy are still extending, are still discussing, and and now is this it's discussing sanctions on Russian sovereign debt. Actually, Russian sovereign debt vulnerable to sanctions is not high. Its foreign debt is only 16% of total government debt. Actually, Russian government is not dependent on foreign financing in covering budget deficit. Russian government issues bond just to make benchmark, to form yield curve for another Russian borrowers. And of course, if sanctions on Russian sovereign debt come into force, it will make it less liquid and more expensive. And according to our estimates, yields, Russian sovereign bond yields will raise by 1.5%. And Russian economy is turning to Asia, especially to China. Last year, Russian export to Asian economies grew, and import as well. Especially you can see growth in import of machinery, and today a half of all imported machinery is China, is from Asian countries, and it was switching to expensive import of equipment after ruble depreciation. How does it affect Russian industries? Here you can see breakdown of Russian GDP and breakdown of Russian GDP growth. The largest Russian industry is oil and gas, but in last 2 years, oil and gas contributed nothing to economic growth in Russia. The largest contributor was agriculture. Agriculture benefited from food embargo on European food import. Who was the loser? The main loser is trade. Trade is responsible for the worst impact on Russian economic dynamics in Russia. Retail trade dropped by 14%, and it has not recovered yet. I have more slides, but I guess it's better to give opportunity to Kirill to continue with his presentation on financial market.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kirill Lukashuk. I am responsible for financial institutions ratings at ACRA. I'm here today to describe you the current situation and the further prospects of Russian financial industry. You may have fair concerns regarding our scope of analysis, taking into account the fact that ACRA is a relatively young rating agency if you compare especially with the big three. But I have an answer on this issue. As you may see, we have 39 assigned ratings to Russian banks. As you probably know, our client of a rating agency has the right to decide whether to go public or keep the rating private. So if you combine all our ratings, private and public, I cannot disclose, unfortunately, the exact figure due to compliance reasons. Our ratings cover more than 80% of Russian banking system. So therefore, we are confident in the quality of our findings. So let's talk about Russian lenders, banks and leasing companies. It may seem that Russian banks are in fairly comfortable situation. Indeed, GDP is growing, some sectors require new lending, and even ACRA's stress indicators show that financial system is far away from the stress. But this is only one side of coin, and I'll show you the back side of the moon, not duck but back. So we have three threats of coming to Russian banks next year. First of all, asset quality. We have a really large portion of toxic assets on the balance sheet of Russian banks, poorly provisioned, and we observe a shift of tolerance of central bank towards recognition of impairment. Second, pressure on net interest and margin. We live in an environment of low interest rates, and the rates will decline further, so NIM will go further with rates, and due to asset liability structure of Russian banks and distorted competition, we think that Russian banks can lose around 100 basis points of net interest margin in next 24 months. And the third point is competition. Steadily increasing share of state-owned institutions and politics of central bank of intervention and nationalization of failed institution really distorts the situation of the market, and I'll show you how. So on the back of described trends, we believe that the growth of the banking system will be subdued around 5% this year. On the long run, we expect only single-digit growth of the banking assets. Key drivers of growth will be mortgages, unsecured lending, and probably mid-sized corporates. So now let's look more carefully on the key areas of risk. First of all, quality of loans. How we assess the quality of a loan book of a bank. We perform loan-by-loan analysis of top 30 exposures of each rated bank. In some cases, we make more, and our personal record is 180 names within the portfolio of a private Russian bank. We had the concerns regarding the quality of its loan book, and we looked through almost all the portfolio. So our study showed that NPLs ratio in the system is around 10%, and problem loans is around 15%. Our definition of problem loans include NPLs, restructured loans, and loans granted to borrowers with a weak credit worthiness. For example, where borrower cannot serve its debt by its cash flows from its operating activity. This is the highest level since 2010. But if you look at the simple figure of problem loans, it's not interesting. I have the most interesting slide in my presentation today. This is a picture of situation with the NPLs, pure overdue loans, and problem loans in banks rated by ACRA. Without names, not to distort your imagination and due to compliance reasons. So on the left, you have amazing gap between NPLs, where we have, for example, 5% NPL in the portfolio of the bank, while problem loans is around 39%. This is all you should know about the quality of several Russian institutions audited by Big Four audit companies and the quality of supervision. This is a really interesting and surprising situation we do see every day in our job. In terms of coverage of problem loans by provisions, our study showed that around half of the portfolio of problem loans is well provisioned. And if you look through the structure of the system, privately owned banks are outsiders with around 49% of coverage, while state-controlled banks have 56% of coverage. The only reason why state-controlled banks looks like better because the government invested a lot last years in the capital of the Russian banks. Estimation is around 2 trillion rubles, and these funds came directly to creation of new provisions to cover problem assets. If you look deeper on the portfolios of the Russian banks, we found that overall situation within private banks and state-controlled banks is quite the same. In terms of problem loans, privately owned banks show the highest rate, while state-controlled banks have the highest exposures to non-core assets and high-risk industries, I mean developing and construction. So overall, these are hidden areas of risk, and we believe the overall credit quality of their portfolios is the same. In terms of capital adequacy, from our point of view, Russian banks at the moment are in so-called growth trap. I mean, if you want to support your profits while rates are decreasing, you should invest more in lending. You should grow your portfolio in nominal terms. But this growth could be associated with a more aggressive risk appetite, and if we call this as aggressive scenario, and in this case, the capital adequacy of the system will be at best the same as now. Around 11.5%, and it's not enough in our view because overall amount of problem loans is around 7 trillion rubles, and in terms of capital buffer we have only 5.3 billion rubles to cover this capital shortfall in stress scenario. Second point of risk, pressure on net interest margin. We believe that NIM will decline further in next years because of historically low interest rates, and surprisingly, because of situation with a position on the asset liabilities structure on the Russian banks. You know, despite having the long position on the balance sheet, surprisingly, loans rates showed more elasticity comparing with the deposit rates. And our understanding that this is due to increasing share of state-owned institutions with relatively cheap funding costs, and news from ACRA case and BIN case when these banks showed really high levels of deposit rates, and even Sberbank increased level of the deposit rates recently. Therefore, our understanding that NIM will lose its position next years. Overall, in terms of profitability, our expectations that we will not return to the past, and our expectation that ROA will be around 1%. And if you exclude Sberbank from the calculation, you will have only 0.5 return on assets on average. Third point of risk, competition. You know, central bank introduced two key measures, structural measures. First of all, central bank introduced two types of licenses. It's a basic license and universal licenses. But they think that the key topic is establishing the banking sector consolidation fund, the new type of sanation and financial rehabilitation of Russian financial institutions. Previous scheme was loan-based. Central bank granted loan to the investor at the interest where interest rate was below market level, 0.5, and according to IFRS, it gained capital and capital adequacy. So the creditworthiness of the institution will be better, but in the environment of decreasing interest rates, we think that situation is worse nowadays, and to rebuild the business model of the bank, you have to invest not by 3 years, but by 5 to 7 years in a row, and we expect surprises from the previous scheme. New scheme within the banking consolidation fund is described here. So a central bank will be direct investing in the equity of failed institution, and effectively will be the final owner of the failed institution, therefore increasing the share of state-owned banks in the system. It's quite okay, but with one point. Estimation of the central bank of the period of selling the bank to the market is 3 years. We have doubts, and we are more conservative. Our assessment is around 7 years. We don't have precedents of fully privatization of a financial company in Russia, and the central bank will have to create a precedent. It's not so easy task. Overall, the share of state-owned banks increased from 55% to 77% nowadays. Talking about the banking sector, I want to comment implications from ACRA and BIN cases for investors. ACRA and BIN cases were the largest stories within the Russian banking sector history in terms of financial rehabilitation and fails. So key implications for investors. Size doesn't matter. After establishing the banking consolidation fund, central bank will protect senior creditors and investors without making any significant stress on the market. So for central bank, size doesn't matter, and for investors in these banks as well. Junior creditors face material risks. As you know, central bank wrote down all 3 issues of sub-debt of ACRA Bank, including grandfathered one. despite legal issues, and this is a really clean sign for investors that if you are holding the junior debt, you are at risk at the moment. Audited statements is only a well-drawn picture. I showed you a slide where we had the NPL ratio and the true level of impairment of problem loans. Bank goes to default when regulator wants. We know that it took 2 years for central bank to discuss with the ACRA management and shareholders the situation with the bank, with the banking group and holding company. And they waited until the liquidity crisis within the bank to intervene. And the final point, it's not enough to be over-liquid to survive. I remind you, ACRA had around 600 billion rubles of liquid assets, and it took 2.5 months to all funds to be flowed down from the bank and to central bank to intervene. So let's move to leasing companies. Good news comparing to the banking sector. We expect volumes of leasing operations are growing very well, and we expect this year to be a record in terms of new leasing volumes with a annual growth rate of 15%. Key reason, absence of regulation and certain sectors specialization. We believe that central bank also looked at these impressive figures of growth and decided to implement new regulation on the leasing market, and they think that this is the key topic for leasing companies in next year. So what's new for leasing companies? New status as a non-credit financial institutions regulated by central bank. Leasing could not be combined with other financial activities. Capital requirements, move to IFRS, market regulation, and new industry standards. What are the consequences? We think that number of companies will decrease and growth rates and ROE as well. But at the same time, transparency and the overall creditworthiness of the companies will be protected and will be better, which is good news for debt investors. I think we finished with the lenders and we can move to insurers. Here, good news for equity investors. We believe that insurance market growth to outpace GDP in the medium term, thanks to low penetration within the Russian economy and development of life insurance segment. What is bad? We do see 2 areas of risks within the insurance market in Russia. First of all, it's obligatory motor third-party liabilities, so-called OSAGO in Russian. This segment has failed so far, and this fail is predominantly associated with the Rosgosstrach story. Second point is investment life insurance. The sector might confront the risk of policyholders growing disappointed by investment life insurance. This may be booming the insurance segment into a shock, but I think it's a medium-term story. Let's wait for the first results of first investments. At the same time, at the cross-sectoral point of view, insurance sector demonstrates the highest ROE among Russian economy, and we expect ROE to decline next years, but I think ROE is going to be enough to support investors' interest into the insurance market. So the last but not the least, funds and asset management companies. General trend is market growth. Growth basis is non-state pension funds, pension savings. We see some potential in open-ended mutual investment funds and investment assets management because of lower interest rates and lower interest of individuals towards bank deposits. In pension system, we expect the insurance pensions has a trend to increase the number, and overall Russian pension system grew from 3.9 trillion rubles to 5.4 trillion rubles in second quarter of this year. This is a significant figure, and in terms of quality of investment portfolio of largest investment funds, we do see local problems, but the thing, overall situation is manageable and controlled by the central bank. So, in conclusion of my story, I hope you now understand that there are three risks of Russian banking system, coming from asset quality, net interest margin pressure, and competition within the sector. Sub-debt of Russian banks is at risk, and the size doesn't matter for CBLR to intervene. Leasing market regulation is the key topic nowadays. Insurance market shows the highest REM on the sector, but risks associated with the life insurance still there. And pension market is growing, and there is a further potential of growth. I hope you learned some interesting stories from me today, and it will be useful for your investment decisions. Let's keep in touch, because there are not too many markets in the world where you can touch the history almost every year. In ACRA we do. Thank you.
And I invite here Dmitry, our Luxembourg-based banker, who is from the real side of economy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dmitry Larin. I am head of the branch here in Luxembourg of RCB Bank Ltd. We are the bank from Cyprus with more than 25 years history. We are the second largest bank in Cyprus under direct supervision of European Central Bank. And here in Luxembourg we have the branch for 3 years, from 2014. So I have, how to say, mixed experience, because before I was in different banks in Russia for 20 years, and now I have limited experience in Luxembourg for 1.5 years, and I'd just like to share my feeling and my view about relations between Russia and Luxembourg, and my own experience as the banker here for 1.5 years. And so I don't like to have a very long and boring presentation, just my personal feeling about the current situation. Of course, I don't like to repeat all facts and figures which was already announced by Natalia about the Russian economy. Trend is positive. Russian economy is on the track for full-year growth. Inflation is slowing. Russian ruble is more or less stable. All prices are higher than expected this year. But of course, I'm not, how to say, so optimistic speaking about the future of Russian economy. And of course, I couldn't say that current sanction regime doesn't have any impact on development of Russian economy. And only one fact: before the sanctions, the trade volume between Russia and European Union was around 430–450 billion euro per year. Now we have around 200 billion euros. So we are speaking about significant decrease of trade volume. But even in this case, the cooperation and partnership between Russia and Luxembourg is really a unique case. And I could say that from my point of view, it's really a very, very unique situation. Because speaking about political relations, I think everybody in this hall knows that this year in October, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Mr. Xavier Bettel, visited Russia, and he participated as one of the main speakers in the Innovative Forum in Skolkovo, our Russian Silicon Valley. Then he met Russian Prime Minister Mr. Medvedev, and from my point of view, they had very efficient and productive negotiations, and they announced some new agreements between Russia and Luxembourg. 2 months before, the first Deputy of Prime Minister and Ministry of Economy, Mr. Etienne Schneider, visited Third Economic Eastern Forum in Vladivostok. So, as I said, it's really a very rare case of very good and stable relations on the highest possible political level. Speaking about economic cooperation, just official figures, because of course Luxembourg is one of the most important investors in Russian economy. Luxembourg has the second place after the Cyprus, speaking about volume of investments into the Russian economy. It was officially announced during this meeting between Mr. Bettel and Mr. Medvedev that investment from Luxembourg to Russian economy as per April 2017 around 47 billion euro. I understand that on the one hand it's a little bit tricky, because we are not speaking about maybe real Luxembourgish investment into Russian economy, but on the other hand it confirms the fact that Luxembourg is the leading financial center, and a lot of businessmen from Russia, a lot of companies from Russia use Luxembourg as the country, as a jurisdiction for their investment vehicles and investment needs, using different types of investment fund. And I see in this conference my colleagues, my friends, who present here different investment funds, alternative investment funds, CIF or RAIF, which use Luxembourg as location, as country for investment into the Russian economy. And by the way, we as the bank, we have our special investment fund as well here in Luxembourg, and we are going to invest, of course, not only in Russian or CIS countries, but we use unique opportunities which provide Luxembourg as jurisdiction for different types of investment. Speaking about trade volume, of course, we are not speaking about such significant volumes, but nevertheless, last year the trade volume between Russia and Luxembourg increased by 15%, and this year for 7 months by 7%. And as I said, from my point of view, it's very unique as well compared to the global decrease of trade volume between Russia and the European Union. And speaking about cooperation in different areas of industry and economy, of course we have traditional cooperation in heavy industry as steel and iron industry, different types of construction. For example, one of the members of our Chamber of Commerce Belgian-Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce and Russian Federation, Luxembourg-based company Astron has for years their factory in Russia, and from my point of view, it's a real success story. But now we are developing new types of cooperation and partnership in different areas such IT and digital technologies, fintech, and even outer space, because everybody knows that Luxembourg is the first country which incorporated in their legal framework the legislation regarding the mining in space, and Russia is still great space state with 60 years history, and in my opinion we have a lot of opportunities to develop this kind of cooperation. Speaking about IT and fintech and digital technologies, Luxembourg has presented itself as how to say, very good area location and country for different types of IT startups. Bearing in mind the location, there are a lot of data centers here in Luxembourg, a lot of fiber optic channels, very good legislation regarding IT development, tax regime and so on. And I know a lot of examples when businessmen and companies from Russia decided to use Luxembourg as the location for their IT startups. For example, speaking about our bank and our branch here in Luxembourg, we have some real cases when our customers, our legal entities with beneficial owners from Russian federations decided to use Luxembourg as a country for their subsidiaries here, for the domiciliation of their companies. For example, one of our customers, which set up here a company in Luxembourg, and together with Luxembourg House of Financial Technologies and one of the biggest audit company in Luxembourg, create a IT startup based on blockchain technologies, and develop some unified registers for KYC and ML purposes and notary services here in Luxembourg. And we try to support this kind of business as well. Speaking about other possibilities to develop business, other example I have very innovative technologies as well. In October this year, the first Deputy of Prime Minister, Mr. Etienne Schneider, presented the new project here in Luxembourg. One of the company originally from Russia decided to set up here in Luxembourg the real production, real factory, which will produce single-wall nanotubes. And one of the main investors of this company is Russian state-owned company Rusnano, which decided to have real production here in Luxembourg with around 200 high-qualified employees. And they decided to move their research and development center from Russia here to Luxembourg. And in my opinion, it's great evidence of possibility to cooperate between Russian business and Luxembourg's business as well. And by the way, the CEO of Rusnano, one of the most famous Russian politicians, Mr. Anatoly Chubais, was here in Luxembourg in November. He participated in the conference of future materials and future technologies, and it's the evidence as well of potential cooperation between Russia and Luxembourg in different types of business. And from my point of view, there are a lot of opportunities to develop business together. I understand that sanctions regimes and the tension between Russia and the United States of America, of course, have real impact on these possibilities and these opportunities. But nevertheless, I'm sure that we have possibility to develop business together. And for example, a very great example of cooperation between Russia and Luxembourg is Max Kremer and Arendt Medernach in general, because this year in October we celebrate the 5th anniversary of representative office of Arendt and Medernach in Moscow. It was an amazing event, and I think that it's a really great example of such cooperation, because from my point of view, Max Kremer make a lot of effort to promote Luxembourg as jurisdiction, to promote Luxembourg as the country for Russian business, to use different opportunities for investments, for the domiciliation of their companies, and it's real respect, because by the way, after this celebration of the anniversary of Arendt and Medernach office in Moscow, I participated in the conference with my colleagues from VTB Group. There were around 40 employees, private bankers, mostly from different regions of Russia, not only from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when I discussed and I told to my colleagues I am from Luxembourg and we have this branch here in Luxembourg for years, and everybody told me, oh, we know Luxembourg, we know Arendt and Medernach. It's practically the only case of cooperation on the level of different types of legal services in Russia. So there are a lot of opportunities, and in my opinion, the Belgian-Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce and Russian Federation make a lot of efforts to develop this business, and I think this conference will support us to develop this business together. Thank you.
Dmitry, thank you very much. That's great to share your experience in Luxembourg in such a positive way. And also thank you very much for the compliments. We are really happy to have our presence in Moscow for now more than 5 years. It was a big success, and we will definitely continue investing in developing this market, so Russia and CIS. Also, thank you very much, Ekaterina, Natalia, and Kirill, for the very sophisticated and interesting presentations that you have made. I'm sure there will be quite some questions afterwards, because you see there are a lot of bankers in the public, and so bankers generally have a lot of interest in your views. Last but not least, I'm very happy also to welcome my partner and friend Philippe-Emmanuel Partsch. He is a professor for European law at the University of Liège in Belgium, and he will give us today an overview over the sanctions regime imposed by the European Union. Philippe-Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, thank you very much, Max, for the kind presentation and this invitation. And I will reassure you, I'm the last speaker. I'm both a lawyer and a professor of EU banking and financial law, but I promise you I will not deliver a too long speech. And I will not address all the issues regarding the restrictive measures. As you know, there are several packages of US and EU restrictive measures relating to Russia, but I will only focus on EU investment restrictive measures. That means that beside some bans, some embargo on trade of some goods like military goods, double-use goods, goods used to the exploration and exploitation of oil and gas. There are two kinds of EU investment restrictions. First, those regarding Crimea and Sevastopol, and I will leave aside that. In just a word, all kinds of investment regarding business located or registered in Sevastopol or in Crimea are prohibited by EU law, real estate, any taking of stake in an entity based or registered in Crimea or Sevastopol. But the main important investment restriction from the European Union relate to some restrictions to the financing of some Russian entities, and more especially Russian financial and some economic operators owned by the Russian state, or at least controlled by it. And there is, for the time being, a list of 8 entities. And in respect with those entities and with subsidiaries, entity outside the EU and owned more than 50% by these listed entities, and entities acting on behalf of or by instruction of those listed entities, there are several prohibitions of financing of those entities. The idea is that the EU entities may not provide long-term or mid-term financial resources to those Russian entities or to some satellites, some subsidiaries of those entities. And in this respect, there is a clear distinction between all the current operations, that is to say, the provision of goods or services to these entities against money, which remained allowed, and all the investment operations. That means that any kind of operation which has as purpose or effect to provide these listed entities with money, with financial resources, which would allow them to achieve some policies considered sensitive by the EU Union, are, as a general rule, prohibited. And in this respect prevails an economic and fact-based approach. It does not matter whether the operation will take the form of or be linked to transferable securities or money market instruments, or even to derivative financial instruments, or to credits or loans. The main point is to see whether those listed Russian entities will be provided with money, or whether their access to the EU financial markets or to any financing by an EU entity will be directly or indirectly eased by the action of any entity of one member state of the European Union. And that means that perhaps from a macroeconomic standpoint, all these measures are not that efficient, if I have understood well some previous presentations. But from a microeconomic, micro-legal standpoint, the legal entities in Europe, in the European Union, have to pay attention and to monitor if in a given operation, the operation will not result in the provision of medium or long-term financial means to one of the 8 listed entities. And the approach of the European Union which is controlled by the European Court of Justice, to some extent is limited. All these provisions, all these regulations have a limited scope, and the Court of Justice of the European Union, notably in the recent Rosneft case, has paid attention not to extend excessively the scope of those prohibitions, notably taking into account the principle of clarity, the requirement that provisions of EU law imposing duties to economic operators must be foreseeable and must be clear, and notably in light of the principle of legal certainty. But it remains that facing a project of operation which could result in the provision directly or indirectly of financial means to one of the Russian entities or to one of their subsidiary or entities controlled by those listed entities, a monitoring has to be made. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philippe-Emmanuel, for this interesting overview. And now it's the moment to get free of charge advice. So you can ask all questions that you might have in mind to the people sitting here. Will be most pleased to answer you. So please. Nobody? Everybody's thirsty? Maybe what I announced already before, there are a lot of bankers in the room, and bankers are generally interested in the sectors that will see growth in a near or medium future. What is your opinion in Russia? In what industry will you see on the medium term, meaning like 1 to 3 years, the biggest growth? Not now taking one of the companies individually, but on the general terms.
We expect a weak economic growth in Russia, but of course it doesn't mean that we don't see any investment opportunities. What investor opportunities do we see? Domestic market growth. Of course, we expect that some industries will grow faster than the whole economy because a lot of markets are still unsaturated, like IT or insurance sectors. And we foresee outstripping growth in markets focused on age population, like pension funds, healthcare, medicine. Another driver is export. Actually, today, almost all Russian producer is looking for export opportunities because there are no opportunities in growth demand, domestic growth demand, and everybody is looking for export opportunities. We expect export growth in Russia in the midterm, especially in oil and gas. Oil, gas, metals, because actually now 3/4 of Russian export is natural resources. As I mentioned, financial sanctions has already absorbed in sanctions has already absorbed in financial sector, but not yet in oil and gas. But we expect growth in oil and gas because the investment of oil companies in last decade was huge, and these investments ensured growth in oil and gas till 2020. I guess effect of current sanctions on oil and gas production in Russia we will see in the middle of 20s.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Another investment opportunities, it's cost cutting. Today, all Russian companies is cutting cost, and all decision in here it's great demand for decision in cost cutting in logistic and financial sector, in retail trade. There are different government programs to support investment in different sectors. For example, stricter environmental requirements forced oil company to modernize in refinery, invest in refinery. Russian government is developing incentive to raise $17 billion in modernizing thermal power plant in Russia, aging power plant in Russia. There is support for renewables in Russia, but actually I expect this support will not be extended in next decade because renewables lose competition to cheap conventional resources in Russia. Russian government is developing scheme for to attract investment in infrastructure construction, especially public partnership, and of course import substitution is going on. Last years it was more visible in agriculture, but we expect import substitution going ahead in other markets with high share of import, like textile, electronics, electronic appliance, construction materials, and it's really going on in many sectors. And for example, at the event in Moscow in November that your Chamber of Commerce held in Moscow, for me it was so interesting to know about so many projects in import substitution of Belgian investors like Decor, APAC, who is opening new factory in Russia. And so there are a lot of different investor opportunities.
Yeah. Very positive. Thank you very much for this very developed and interesting answer. And any other questions from the public? They're also shy today. Yeah. Gentleman in the last row.
You know, Kirill is working on this because he recently had a new baby. We're contributing as much as we can. But it will not change the big picture. Unfortunately, it's quite negative, as Natalia was already mentioning. There is some hope for inflow of workers from neighboring countries, but as ruble depreciated a lot some time ago, it's not that much attractive anymore. They're coming back, and unfortunately the labor law is also not very favorable. Immigration law is not very favorable. For example, ourselves, we're bringing some people to our staff. For example, in some areas where Russia really lacks skills, like securitization and project finance ratings, recently hired a guy who is 50% Peronian, 50% Japanese with a Spanish passport, and we brought him from London. Wow. This is the guy who learned Russian for 2 years to work with us. He passed the exam, but then we spent about 2 months, one girl working for us in the countryside, really in a village in the middle of nowhere, going there every day in order to make papers for him. This is difficult because unfortunately the labor law is very protective. What would help is efficiency. It's really the competitive advantage of Russia. We're inefficient, lucky we are, we can improve many things. There are many things which are done in a very, very basic way. And without really changing too much the processes, well, you can achieve a lot. And then pension age. Inevitably, it will be adjusted. This would help somehow. That is why probably efficiency plus some immigration plus some of the kind of pension age adjustment, it might help. On the other hand, whether there is a demand, not necessarily. Again, inflow of capital is quite limited, as it was described. That is why it's kind of a slow-growing, kind of stagnating situation, with a lot and lot of movements below this big picture. That is why, well, myself and colleagues would confirm this. Many people are comparing the current situation with the end of 90s. I think the comparison in terms of shock is irrelevant. The shock, the stress is definitely not comparable. On the other hand, the speed of change is enormous. And I think this is where the foreign investors are losing compared to the Russians and insiders, because it's very difficult to monitor. Things, personalities, processes, decision-making, everything is changing just in one day. Probably here this is the good moment to recollect one big saying by a Russian writer. Russia changes a lot in 1 year and doesn't change in 100 years. This is exactly the moment where everything is changing very, very rapidly, and all these changes are very incremental. It's difficult to monitor. I realized this when a friend of mine came back after maternity leave of 3 years. She said, wow, I just doesn't recollect the community. I do not recognize anybody, not politicians. Well, some faces are still there for quite a while and will stay. But below that, sometimes it takes some humoristic forms, like you might know that the government is now investing in creating a new dream team of regional governors, and they're even bringing them to Sochi, and they jump from the mountains, whatever, team building in a Western way, and they're changing these governors a lot. Maybe my colleagues can help me, but out of 70-something governors, just in 1 month they changed 20-something. New faces, new guys, not even from the regions, and very young. One of the examples might be the head of our Ministry of Economic Development. Well, I still believe that I'm young. He's about my age. And these are very Western educated and Western kind of oriented and open-minded people, bringing some kind of new wave. On the other hand, coming back to your question, whether it will give something, not necessarily immediately. The potential, the capacity of the economy and the demand inside is not enough to compensate for these shortages. You should not expect Russia changing its concentration onto oil and gas. Some time ago, Russia celebrated 100-year anniversary from the highest economic pre-revolutionary peak. It was in 1913. It's interesting if you compare the Russian economy composition in 1913 and in about now, you would be extremely disappointed. We haven't moved too much. The composition changed somewhat. It is, and it was still very much resource-oriented economy. But you can imagine, well, oil was only starting. What was it then? Can you guess? Something which is coming back now, agriculture. Agriculture, like timber, whatever. We exported before timber, and now we export oil and metals, and to some extent electricity. Again, raw materials were very much historically oriented to raw materials. On the other hand, below the surface, many things are changing. And this is where we hope to help you to monitor how this transformation is going on. That is why, well, it was a long way of answering your question. Thanks for this question. I know that everybody's desperately thinking about one single question: where drinks?
Where the drinks?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe one very quick last question, which is twofold, to be answered within 1 minute. One to you, Ekaterina. Which sanctions do you think were impacting more the Russian economy, the European ones or the American ones? And one to you afterwards, Philippe-Emmanuel, do you see any positive trend in relation to the European sanctions?
In short, American.
Okay.
Why? Because they kind of overlap with anything which we should be realistic, decided in EU and very much in Asia. In some neighboring countries, we know the examples when, without introducing sanctions there, some big companies were receiving letters from American embassies disadvising to work with Russian companies. That is why the answer is clear. On the other hand, I remember that it was mentioned that apparently the impact of sanctions was not that severe as that. This is true. Why? Because if Europe and US wanted to really penalize Russia, they should stop the pipe, the oil pipe. Natalia mentioned that the dependence on foreign debt used to be insignificant. The banking system, like Kirill was mentioning, has always been historically net creditor to the West, meaning that depositing more than borrowing, kind of foreign currency positive, and this is the benefit of Russian population saving in foreign currency. The foreign currency inflow is coming, and well, I would say the Russian banking system is more dependent on foreign currency brought from under the mattresses of its population, other than from borrowing from abroad. And we should put everything in the right context. The inflow of foreign currency is not through borrowings, it's through exports. If you really want to penalize, you should do something to exports. On the other hand, the reciprocal impact on the trading partners of Russia might have been severe. That is why we're too much interrelated now. We're big guys and girls, and we're playing games, but we should realistically understand the true impact of certain actions. And here we're playing a lot of games, but the economies adjust. And again, we should be very careful in every step we're taking, because every step we're taking, it impacts everybody.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. I agree with your analysis regarding the relative or respective efficiency of the US and EU measures. Regarding the EU measures, first, the European Union has not worsened the restrictive measures for months and even years. And to some extent, the last amendments go in the sense of a reduction of the EU restrictive measures, notably in the area of planes, aircrafts, and so on. Second, the European Union and some European governments have tried to put the pressure on the US authorities to avoid the extraterritorial application of the new US rules to EU companies in relation with business with Russia. And third, there is progressively a more favorable move in favor of business between the European Union and Russia, due notably to the Brexit, because of the macroeconomic impact of the Brexit, the negative macroeconomic impact of the Brexit on the European economy. The European economy is looking for other sources of business and economic activities with third countries. And finally, even so, the issue is a point of crisis and of divergences between some European countries. It seems that there is relatively a more favorable trend in favor of the Nord Stream 2 project, notably at the level of the European institutions.
I think, again, to put it in a big picture view, helicopter view, I think not sanctions themselves are irritating or problematic. Threats of new sanctions. They create a lot of frustration. And this is what is difficult. And I think macroeconomists or scientists can make even some measures of how much digit points of GDP growth, whatever it can cost Russia. Frustration can cost a lot. Because this also comes on top of this very important management transformation which is going on, because Russia, for the first time ever, again, through books, Russia is now new, because for many, many years you got used to the concept of boom and bust economy. This is what Russian management is very proud of, that we can deal with many, many crises. But Russia has no experience of dealing with quiet times. And this is why, for example, politicians are changing, and I'm sure that there will be even a new wave of management changes. The problem is, again, no inflow of senior managers from outside. And again, another problem with sanctions, as I already mentioned, it's more about technology and experience shortage. This is where Russia really suffers, and this is where it is the most painful. And that is why, even for newcomers like us, we have a huge potential for growth and contributing for these upgrades and transformation in Russia. This is where Russia needs a lot of help. Technology, experience, new skills, and unfortunately this is what contributes to lagging behind. We're losing a lot in terms of technologies, IT. Russia tries to develop many IT projects on its own, but you know, it's in isolation, it's never the efficient way to go. That is why I was saying about these threats and about this uncertainty. Unfortunately, the human minds are such that people are thinking about sanctions in a much bigger context than in reality they are. And this is what is the biggest problem.
Thank you very much for this interesting statement. And hereby I think everybody is now thirsty and hungry. So I would like to thank you all in the name of the Chamber of Commerce, in the name of Arendt Medernach, and also in the name of Dmitry of RCB for your valuable input, and especially thanks to the ACRA team for making all the way from Moscow to Luxembourg. Thank you very much for the great contributions, and everybody is now more than welcome to join us for a nice cocktail and some food next door. Thank you.